Let's take a look at the different exposure modes and how you might use them. Click on the wrench, and here we can see the different exposure modes available. Now we've already used the first three modes, but let's take a recap of each one and its effect. The first is center mode. In center mode, the ISO and shutter speed is set automatically. The exposure point of interest is the center of the image, but you can use the bias control to adjust exposure. Moving this slider will adjust a combination of ISO and shutter speed. This is a bright sunny day, so the software has set the ISO low at 34 and the shutter to 1/109. If I want to increase the brightness and move the slider to +2, the ISO stays low, but the shutter speed is slower, which will let more light in. If we go to +3, the shutter is now 1/40, and that's as low as it can go for the frame rate that we've chosen to film in, which is 30 frames per second. So in order to brighten the screen, the ISO is now being increased from 38 to 396. If we go back to 0, the ISO goes back to around 34 and the shutter speed back to 1/107. But if we go the other way to -2, because we want the screen to be darker or the image darker, the ISO will stay low at 48, but the shutter speed is increased to 1/510, letting in less light. If we go further to -3.3, we now see that the ISO never really changes, but the shutter speed gets much faster, in this case to 1/1263 or 9 degrees. And this will not let a lot of light in at all because it's moving so fast, so our image gets darker. So this is how the bias control allows you to brighten and darken your image in center exposure mode. Next we have spot mode. The ISO and shutter speed are again set automatically. The spot reticle determines the exposure point of interest, and again the bias controls adjustment for the exposure. The exposure spot reticle can be moved around the screen, and wherever you put it, that's the area that will be sampled, and the rest of the image will be adjusted based on that little sample area. Again, because it's a sunny day, the ISO value is kept low and the shutter will be adjusted. If we place it on a bright area like the sky, the shutter will get faster, so not as much light will reach the sensor. If we move it somewhere darker like down here on the lake, the shutter slows down, so more light reaches the sensor and the image gets brighter. And remember, the light meter is always trying to make the image a mid-bright image, as we saw in the metering lesson previously. Again, we have the bias control, also known on other camera systems as exposure compensation or EV on the DJI Pocket system. Here at 0, we see that the ISO is at 37 and the shutter value is at 1/150. If we move the slider to +2, we see that the shutter gets slower at 1/66, and that'll let more light into the sensor, making the overall image brighter. Or if we go darker, we see that the shutter gets faster, which we know stops the light getting to the sensor, so our image gets darker. The next mode is manual mode, and as you expect, we have full manual control of ISO and shutter speed. The ISO value can be adjusted using the ISO slider to increase brightness or reduce brightness for a darker image. And the shutter speed can be controlled using the shutter slider. And the shutter slider speed is in shutter angle. Setting this angle to 180 degrees will automatically set the shutter speed to twice the frame rate value for that cinematic motion blur. So using this, you have full control over all parameters for exposure. The next mode we have is ISO priority mode. In this mode, the ISO and shutter speed will be set automatically, and the priority is given to keep the ISO value low. In this mode, we go to the exposure meter and we can set the maximum ISO value from auto, 250, 500, or 1000. We can also set the minimum shutter angle from 10 to 40 degrees. This can prevent the shutter angle getting too low and stop the image getting too dark. Remember, the lower the shutter angle, the faster the shutter speed, so the image gets darker. Let's set it to 40 degrees. So now we see that in ISO priority, it keeps the ISO at a low value. We told the software, don't set the shutter any lower than 40 degrees, which is 1/270 shutter speed. And we see that the image is blown out, because the limit of the shutter is now 40 degrees. And that's not a fast enough shutter to adjust this bright image for the correct exposure. You can see if we go back to the center mode, it sets the shutter to 2 degrees, or 1/5435, as its shutter speed to correct exposure. And in this mode we see the shutter speed slider can't go any lower than 40 degrees. And even the bias control has minimum effect, as it's always trying to keep the ISO value low. We see that we're in matrix mode. So if we click on the matrix logo at the top, we get another menu where we see all exposure modes. We can choose center mode here again, and that takes us back to the center mode. Let's go back to the exposure meter settings and set the minimum shutter angle back to 10 degrees. And this will allow the shutter more bandwidth to adjust for the exposure when needed. It's also recommended to use an ND filter if you're outside on a bright day in ISO priority mode. So I added a variable ND filter that has 3 to 5 stops. We're in center mode in settings, and let's turn on our histogram scope. I'll just rotate the ND filter to get the histogram looking centered. And we see that our ISO is at 34, our shutter speed is at 1/40, or 267 degrees. And the image looks good, so we can turn off the histogram at this point. So with the ND filter on, let's go from center mode to ISO priority mode. So in ISO priority mode, its priority is to keep a low ISO value, and it's going to adjust the shutter speed based on the light meter to get what it thinks is a good mid-bright image. But we see the image is too dark, as it set the shutter to 15 degrees, or 1/720 as our shutter speed. If we click on the bias slider, we see that the light meter is sitting right at 40% with its bias set at 0, so it thinks it's correct for a mid-bright image. We can also see if we try to adjust the shutter slider, it has minimal or no effect. Clicking on the matrix icon, we can go back to the center exposure and click on Done for it to take effect. Now let's go back to ISO priority mode once more, where we see that the ISO is low and the shutter is automatically adjusted. So we can use the bias slider to go to +2, and we see that it increases the shutter angle to make the image brighter, but still keeps the ISO value low. We see that if we go the other way, it adjusts the shutter again to a minimum value in the settings, which was 10 degrees that we saw earlier. So the software keeps the ISO low and drives the shutter value until the matrix light meter gets to 40% on the light meter scale. But as we see in this case, that's too dark. Again, the camera just looks at the light and dark areas and adjusts the image to create a mid-bright area using the matrix mode. So this ISO priority mode can be used to make sure that you keep your ISO levels low, which helps grain and noise, but as you see, can make the scene too dark visually. So in this particular case, we can use the bias control to increase the shutter angle, which slows down the shutter, letting in more light to the sensor and making the image brighter. Next we have shutter priority mode. The ISO is set automatically, and the shutter speed can be set using manual control shutter slider. The bias control offsets the target value of the exposure meter. We have an ND filter still attached. Let's go back to center mode as a starting point. I'll select the histogram and adjust my variable ND. And that looks good here. Our shutter speed's at 1/68 or 159 degrees. So let's close this histogram scope. Now we'll select shutter priority mode. Here we see that the ISO value has been set to 24, and the shutter angle is now 40 degrees, and it's increased the shutter speed to 1/271. If we choose the bias control and go up to +2, as seen here, we're in shutter priority mode. The shutter won't change, but the software will adjust the ISO value, and it goes from 24 to about 50. But if we go to -2, we're still in shutter priority mode, so the shutter won't change, and the ISO value can't go down any lower. So this has no effect on making the image darker. So let's put it back to 0 for now. But we can affect the image exposure by using the manual shutter control. So if we want the image brighter, just make the shutter angle larger. Here we're at 180 degrees, and the ISO value is still low at 24. Remember, to go brighter, the shutter angle gets bigger, and the shutter speed value gets smaller. You could also use one of the analytic tools to help you, like false color, or zebras to assist. So let's take a look at shutter priority indoors in a darker environment. We're currently in center exposure, and we see that the ISO has been set to 449. It's also got a shutter angle of 269 degrees, so quite large, or 1/40 is a shutter speed. So that's trying to get as much light in as it can. So even with this high shutter angle that lets in a lot of light, the ISO will still be around 500. Let's go to shutter priority mode, and we see that the ISO is dropped to 113. And it did this to drive the exposure down until the light meter hits that 40% mid-bright level that it's looking for. And we see this on the exposure meter here. If we want the image to go brighter, we can use the bias control to adjust it. Setting it to +2 increases the ISO up to approximately 2500. Again, as we're in shutter priority, it won't adjust the shutter automatically. We'd need to use the shutter speed slider to affect this. If we remember, in the previous videos we were outside and it was really sunny, so it would not adjust the ISO to increase brightness. But indoors in a darker environment, ISO is what's being affected with the bias control. Here at +1, the ISO is at 310. And if we go to -2, the ISO drops down to its lower value that it can at about 34. So in shutter priority means it's always trying to keep the shutter at the same point, and it'll move the ISO when it can, especially indoors, to increase brightness and darkness of the image. If you're outside on a sunny day, the software will almost always set the ISO to its lowest value because it's really bright. So if you want to increase or decrease the image, you're going to have to use a shutter slider control to affect exposure. And I hope that makes sense for the exposure modes and how they work. For full access to this extensive masterclass, visit our website. Stay safe, keep creating, and I'll see you next time.